Welcome, everyone. Good morning, and thank you so much for coming for this webinar. It's 1st of March today. It's been exactly 3 months since the start of COP28 in Dubai, the largest COP, arguably the most inclusive ever. And we've had the benefit of hearing from the ministry and the minister on 8th of February, just 3 weeks ago, about the key outcomes of COP. Today, let's unpack them and work out how we can collectively contribute to this important conversation relating to an existential crisis. I'm delighted and grateful we have such an esteemed lineup of individuals who will be sharing their wisdom and insights with us this morning. There are many thought leaders whom we would have loved to profile, but unfortunately we had to pick a much smaller group than we wanted to. We would like to hear from all of you, so please share your questions in the Q&A box, not the chat box, so that all speakers have the opportunity to respond in writing or online if they so wish. The written responses will also be picked up in the accompanying blog posts. First off, allow me to welcome our esteemed keynote speaker, Ms. Meena Raman, Head of Programs at the Third World Network, President of Syabat Alam Malaysia, and a practicing public interest lawyer. COP28 is her 16th COP, and she's written a book on the COPs called Clash of Climate Change Paradigms with the late Martin Kaur, also of Third World Network. You will know by now she has prepared extensive notes on this topic and her deck has been shared beforehand. The link was in your reminder email which went out this morning and is also in the chat box. So we decided to pivot from her presenting the slides to a conversation with her. So please share your thoughts, any questions you may have in the Q&A box so that we can get round to it. Meanwhile, Meena, thank you so much for coming online with us this morning. As a long time COP veteran and deep in the trenches of negotiations, please give us an overview of what you saw at COP28, how motivated or inspired or how anchored or frustrated you felt. Over to you, Meena.
Thank you very much, Datin, Sunita, and thank you to Climate Change Governance Malaysia. It's indeed an honor. While the world, a lot of leaders were clapping, in terms of the first time mention of fossil fuels in the text, in terms of transitioning away. That was what the media headlines were. Some of us, particularly those of us in civil society who have been examining and following the COP for a long time, we actually are much more critical about the outcome. And it wasn't just us, it was actually a COP of mixed reactions. The Alliance of Small Island States, for instance, said that this is not transformative enough. What was agreed to was only incremental steps. And they even were very upset that the mention of transition fuels or natural gas has been allowed, while looking at fossil fuels in the context of the kind of technologies which were proposed. There was a lot of concern over the technologies that were proposed, particularly in relation to carbon dioxide removals. So you would see that for some of us, the whole focus about the North Star being the 1.5 degree limit, which was everybody, from the US to many of the European leaders and so on, all of them were talking about how this is the North Star in terms of the limiting temperature rise to 1.5. And some even went as far as saying that the decision actually takes us to that direction. For many of us, this is not the case, because I think one of the important aspects of this is that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the 6th assessment report, has already very clearly showed that much of the carbon budget, which to limit a 50% probability of crossing the 1.5 degree temperature goal compared to pre-industrial levels, is only 500 gigatons. And we have something like, with current trends, we only have something like about 8 to 10 years left before that budget is exhausted. So if you take that perspective, and then you see also the recognition in the global stocktake decision. As you know, the global stocktake was a Paris Agreement obligation to take a collective overview of the assessment of where parties are. So it's not just coming from the Paris Agreement, but also what was achieved or not achieved under the convention. It's quite clear that they acknowledge that 4/5 of that carbon budget has already been overconsumed, and that what is remaining is very small. What they did not, however, mention that much of this was actually the responsibility or the historical responsibility of the developed countries. So you can see that the main problem here is that if you don't focus on the remaining carbon budget, but you just focus on language like, just and equitable and orderly transition away from fossil fuels, which is there in the text, without saying who has to do what by when, you actually are not addressing the temperature limit that needs to be abided by. And so this is the underlying problem. Because if you look at the famous paragraph 28, which is the mentioning of the transitioning away from fossil fuels, and I've mentioned this in the slides, you would see that the chapeau, the opening paragraph to that actually says that whether it's the tripling the global renewable energy target, energy efficiency, and all the other measures, all of this is actually in the context of national circumstance. So countries are, and totally in their perspective, have to take into account their national circumstance in order to look and assess their next nationally determined contribution, which is the architecture of the Paris Agreement. So if you do not have a bottom-up, you don't have a top-down approach. This is something that many of us in civil society and even some governments were calling for in terms of an equitable sharing of the carbon budget in a fair way. If you don't have that and you just say that every country can do what it likes to do, we are not going to get there. And this is the frustration. And I think those of us who have been in this field see this as a major problem. The other problem that we know, which already arose in Glasgow, which is about the net zero claim. Now, you know that in the Paris Agreement, there's a global net zero aspiration. That means overall by 2050, you balance the emissions with the sinks. But what we actually saw in Glasgow was everybody pledging net zero. Now, you can't have the developed world, which has already overused the carbon budget and what we all call carbon colonialism, continue to say that they will do net zero by 2050. This is doing too little too late. So it's not going to reach the North Star or limit the damage from the North Star. So this is, I think, the hypocrisy that we saw of the West. And in fact, a report by one of the Oil Change International shows that the rich five polluters, historic polluters, are actually expanding fossil fuel production. So you have to see behind the headlines and really that there is no equity in this. And this is why the frustration was rising. But one of the good things that I think arose, and for Malaysia, I think this is very key. Of course, the Loss and Damage Fund was acknowledged as an important outcome. There's a governing instrument. The board is supposed to be set up. The board has still not been set up because developed countries are still fighting as to who will be on the board. So they're delaying this aspect. But unfortunately, it's only like 700 million that's in the Loss and Damage Fund at the moment, which is really peanuts compared to what is needed. And then the global goal on adaptation, for me, this is really a very important outcome. And the other, of course, is the Just Transition Work Program. For developing countries, the Just Transition Work Program is very important because the whole underpinning of climate responses, because Malaysia, for instance, is only about less than 1%, something like 0.4% of the global emissions. It doesn't mean we don't do, it means that we have to do. But on top of what we are doing, if the rest of the world is not doing their fair share, we're not going to get there. So global goal on adaptation is very, very key. It was something that the Group of 77 and China, which is the negotiating bloc of developing countries, fought for after a lot of fight. So for me, it's significant because this missed the headlines. And this is about what they call the UAE Framework for Global Climate Resilience. So, significantly reducing climate-induced water scarcity, for instance, enhancing climate resilience in relation to water, very, very key. Attaining climate-resilient food and agricultural production. So this is about sustainable agriculture, regenerative production, adequate food, and so on. Another very important aspect for sustaining our basic needs. The other aspect is actually first-time mention of resilience against health-related impacts of climate change. Never there before, very, very critical. And then, of course, this is something that many of us also support, reducing climate impacts on ecosystems and biodiversity, very, very critical. including through the use of ecosystem-based adaptation and nature-based solutions. Also increasing the resilience of infrastructure and human settlements. This is something that we don't see enough of. So this is very key. And also, I thought what was significant was substantially reducing the adverse effects of climate change on poverty eradication. That means the impacts of climate change on poverty eradication itself and livelihoods. New aspects, so the recognition for the need for more social protection and so on. So these are very critical aspects, including protection of cultural heritage. And of course, there are other aspects in the global goal on adaptation which relate to having early warning systems by 2027, how assessing our vulnerabilities and risks, planning, and so on. But of course, fundamental to this is climate finance and support. And this is very, very important. And this is the other outcome that happened in COP28, which will be very critical as we go to Baku, is just the new collective quantified goal on finance. This year is a finance COP. So there is a new collective quantified goal that is supposed to be talked about. And in fact, the decision recognizes that we need to negotiate this much earlier in the process and not wait until November when the COP resumes. So for Malaysia, I think this is also critical because if you look at the NETR, for instance, so there are also estimates that only for the energy transition, we need something like $682 billion. And this is only for the energy transition. But if we take into account adaptation, and if we are serious about adaptation, and if we are also serious about loss and damage, it's not just about the floods, but beyond the floods, we need a lot more. So for me, the key takeaways from this process is actually for Malaysia to be very active in relation to adaptation, loss and damage, climate finance. The other thing I'll say is the prospects for 2024. It's looking like a very, very bleak multilateral process. Of course, you know that the developed countries always want to move away from the common but differentiated responsibility because we think equity is very fundamental because not all of us have equal responsibility. It's a differentiated responsibility. And then you see that the Trump administration, you see Trump coming back, and this is really bad news, a climate denier. You see, even in the European Parliament, we understand that more and more right-wing governments will be represented, so who will not take climate seriously. So this is really a very, very deep concern because, coming out of COP28, we would have expected a lot more ambition and support and multilateralism in the face of climate, but this is not happening. The final thing I'll say, we are at an all-time low in terms of trust in the process because of also the Palestinian crisis, the war in Gaza and the West Bank, as you can see, where all, there's a talk of human rights and how the Western world preaches human rights to the rest of us, but we are sick and tired of their preaching. And I'm quite blunt about this because all the international humanitarian, not just humanitarian, but international law on human rights, all being violated in the name of the war in Gaza. So how can you actually trust a process where people just, violate all international law in this process? So I think we are up for a huge challenge. And this is in this context we're having this conversation, and I look forward to further engagement. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Meena. Thank you. We've got some questions in the Q&A box. Maybe you might want to read it. But in the meantime, I wanted to ask you as well, Meena, how do we balance the need to take urgent, ambitious climate action versus our negotiating priorities, where we're recognizing historical responsibilities? Because there is much that we can do as a business within our industries, in our communities, and in our country as well. And I also wanted to ask you to touch on the lag effect. Before the IPCC comes up with new scenarios, we're still talking about net zero 2050, halving by 2030, and so on and so forth. But we know we've already overshot 1.45 degrees of warming. So could I leave this with you? And also the questions in the chat box. So you only have a few minutes more before our next keynote speaker comes on. Thank you, Meena.
Yeah, thank you, Datin. I think it's important. While we also are part of the global community, we have to do what is best. But there is a limit on so much of what, as a developing country, we can do. Now, that's why I say climate finance is critical. Relying on domestic resource mobilization alone is not going to be easy for us. So while our next NDC that we are framing, while we do indicate what we can do as a nation, we also do need to look at what is conditional in terms of higher ambition. And it's only not just a mitigation NDC, but it's also adaptation. It has to be key to that because, as I said, for us, that's a priority, and also indicating loss and damage. On the issue, I see here a question from Rahim Nick. I think it's somebody that I know. Transitioning away from fossil fuels has triggered much concern. The escape route for developed countries to develop further other fossil fuels. It's true because the gas issue has been left out because there's an opening for gas, and of course, much of it is a problem. And so we do need to address this. And for those of us, in Malaysia and other developing countries, the issue of the peaking of emissions, this was something that the Alliance of Small Island States called for. They wanted a peaking of emissions. Now, the problem here was that a lot of developing countries, particularly India, China, and others, they couldn't agree to a peaking by 2025. It's just impossible. And so, while that's why the equity-based approaches in terms of carbon emissions is actually important. The Firechat in climate mitigation is the approach that we need to take. So if you look at the Paris Agreement, it gives a longer time for developing countries to peak, while developed countries actually peak and decline much further. But if the developed world is very serious, they should have gotten to net negative emissions today, but that's not the case. So this is why I started by the carbon budget and the overuse of the carbon budget and the historical responsibility, which is key. I'm not sure if I answered all your questions, but in terms of the things, I didn't mention carbon trading. That's the other problem that we are seeing. I mentioned that a lot of the NDC pledges talk about sinks sequestering carbon. Now, the problem here in terms of carbon trading, there's actually no more room for carbon offsets internationally. Is a different matter. That if we balance our emissions with our sinks at the national level for national accounting purposes, that means while we decarbonize, we increase the sinks as well. And but what is important is that some of our states are already approaching the voluntary carbon market, and if they sell the carbon credits internationally, we cannot count that to our national emissions. And so this is where the federal state problem comes in. We see this happening in Sabah. We see this happening in Sarawak. So there is no coherence there. And this is really a problem. So if we are trading away the sinks that we have for our own transition, then I think we are in danger of that means we'll have to do much more climate mitigation of a higher cost.
Yeah, thank you so much, Meena. I'm always reminded that we're never going to have enough time with you. But if you could please stay on and help us respond in writing to the questions in the Q&A box, so we'd be very grateful. Meanwhile, please welcome our keynote speaker, Dave Sivaprasad of BCG, BCG was the principal strategy and action partner to COP28 and the official knowledge partner to the ministry for COP28. Thank you so much, Dave. Over to you.
Well, thank you, Datin, Sunita, for this kind invitation to participate here, and Meena, it was great to hear your perspectives and always, a rich view of the process and where we are and the priorities that we need to take forward. I thought I'll take 10 minutes just to share, a bit of an overview, and I'll index a little bit more on the non-state actors and the outcomes from COP. Coming out from this. So negotiation was the key outcome. There's a lot of things that happened, at the sideline of COP as well, with the action agenda and the private sector, non-state actors, civil society as well. So I'll share a little bit of outcome from this, and hopefully this is then a good input into some of our discussion for the rest of the session. Thank you, Gunalan, for sharing these slides. If we go to the first one, just to give a bit of a recap on the next page. On this was a massive COP. I mean, we had more than 100,000 people just in the blue zone. Multiple public sector, private sector leaders. civil society. So it was a massive, let's say, platform convening many stakeholders together on the climate agenda. Now, if we go to the next page, we talked about this, and Meena mentioned this, and Sunita, you mentioned this as well. We're still quite far off. We've seen the highest temperatures over the course of 2023 on record, and we still have a fair way to go on reducing our emission footprint globally, and our pathway towards reducing emissions by 43% by 2030 is still quite challenged, right? And a lot of things need to happen for us to meet this objective collectively. If we go to the next one, just as a little bit of a recap on why this COP was so important, it was the global stocktake, the midpoint from the Paris Agreement to the 2030 milestone, which is particularly important for us to keep on track. So that's just a little bit of background on the COP, and maybe moving forward, the next page. A lot of things were happening on this COP, right? So you had, of course, the formal negotiations between parties is the key activity and engagement that happens. But on the sideline of this, there's the action agenda, the non-state actors, the high-level champions are active in engaging across different constituents to progress the agenda, and you have the thematic days on covering all the key issues. And one notable one, of course, was the health edition, which is the climate and health being a key priority for us to push forward. So what I'll share is a bit more index on the action agenda, and what came out from the non-state actors on 10 areas, 5 that were quite decisive, let's say, markers of progress, and 5 that were a bit more emerging. So if the next page, you see 5 areas. I'll just give you a quick rundown. Renewables, energy efficiency, a big step forward with these commitments of tripling RE capacity globally, and doubling down on energy efficiency. So this saw wide agreement and wide commitment to drive it, and of course in the end it's about action on the ground, but significant commitment and momentum behind transition in the energy system around renewables and energy efficiency in this COP. Methane, a broad commitments, particularly on companies that are large emitters on methane, and certainly Petronas in Malaysia has been one of the leaders on this, together with many of the other oil and gas companies that have committed to make massive reductions on methane emissions coming out of this COP. On the heavy emitting sectors, here talking about cement, steel, air transport, and so on, the launch of this Industrial Transition Accelerator, which brings together cross-sectoral initiatives to decarbonize, and also signals from government on green public procurement to commit to buy green steel, green cement, are market signals, good market signals to catalyze transition in these hard to abate and challenge sectors in transition. A big focus on food and agriculture, particularly on commitments to include food targets in transition planning, and large private sector organizations and non-state actor organizations in agriculture, together with the FAO also involved, making commitments around regenerative agriculture stepping up and scaling up by 2030. And we've seen a lot of commitments and movement on the finance end, certainly with the multilateral development bank commitments to really shift what they're financing much more on mitigation and adaptation. The launch of this Altera fund with UAE backed with other funders as well, which brings in a combination of commercial and also sub-commercial capital to help mobilize and catalyze investments in transition projects and transition technologies. And of course the loss and damage fund. Meena, you spoke about this as well. Some commitments going in, still much more to be done, and at least a mechanism that has a pathway for it to operationalize. So coming out of the COP in December last year, some 5 big areas on decisive progress. If we go to the next page, some emerging areas, let's say, where this is growing momentum and certainly a lot more to be done. A big focus on nature in this COP, in COP28, with funding being committed, with countries recognizing and committing to address the challenges of fresh water and water resilience with the effects of climate. And businesses and financial institutions also starting to make some headway of moving not just on climate plans, but also nature positive plans. And we're seeing some of that here in Malaysia also, on companies taking movement on their agenda around nature positive. On health, first time we've had a health day at COP, a very important agenda and issue to address. Declarations by countries and organizations to address this issue, but I would say it's still early days on the health agenda. On adaptation and resilience, I think this is the first COP that we're starting to see a lot more private sector movement behind this. So it's always been a public sector challenge, and this COP has seen a lot more private sector, mobilization, both in terms of private sector recognizing the impact this has on short to mid-term interests, commercial interests, assets, cash flows, balance sheet, but also that there is a need for solutions in adaptation that needs to be fulfilled, and the private sector can play a role to deliver these solutions. So a lot of movement on this on the ANR front. On voluntary carbon markets, a big focus on the integrity of these offsets and some new mechanisms such as the core credit initiative to support early retirement being announced. And finally on hydrogen, the launch of ISO specifications on how you calculate low carbon hydrogen is a big step forward that then allows for comparisons and movement of hydrogen in the market. So these are some of the highlights that we saw from our vantage point on some big areas of movement and some growing momentum. Then if we go to the next page, so on the negotiation, and I won't dwell on this too much, I think Meena covered it very well. Certainly momentum on the energy transition end, on mitigation, good progress on agreeing on some aspects of the global goal of adaptation, and also a call for national adaptation plans to be developed by all countries. Progress on the NDCs, where coverage should extend on all emissions, all sectors, all categories in the next round, and having targets for 2030. And we talked about the loss and damage outcome. And then maybe just to wrap up in the last two, if we go to the next one. I think this was a big step of progress on the energy transition mitigation end, that in the text of negotiated outcome, the tripling of renewables, the efficiency, the transition away from fossil fuels, all good let's say agreements, and of course the next step is action, right, behind all of this. So if we go to the last one. Ultimately, as all of us would violently agree, the commitments are important, but the action is the most critical behind this to get it going. So maybe just taking a few lenses on this, on the private sector, on the company end, what's going to be important is delivering on commitments, reporting transparently, increasing the level of collaboration across the value chain, with peers. And moving from climate to nature positive and advancing that agenda. So a big set of priorities for private sector and companies in any given sector to take forward. For governments, really taking on these commitment of expanding the coverage of NDCs and setting targets for 2035. Implementing the policy measures that are needed to change the incentives in the market to allow transition to happen in these respective sectors. Playing a role in demand signals, in green public procurement where feasible, and stepping up both the planning, investment, and implementation and adaptation measures at the local level. And finally, on the financing end, all actors in the financial system have parts to play. The MDBs are very much, in that process of reform, and they made commitments on increasing climate financing, both mitigation and adaptation for FIs, for the commercial banks. It's really looking at where they can push the envelope on increasing their share of portfolio on climate finance, and for philanthropic foundation capital to deploy part of the capital capacity they have to catalyze and support transition where it's underserved. I think this is a big priority then for the capital that is able to be deployed with lower or concessional returns. So let me stop there. Datin, Sunita, thanks again for the invitation to share a little overview, and maybe I'll hand back for our discussion.
Thank you so much, Dave, for sharing this comprehensive and thorough overview. This is the second time I'm hearing it, and I'm still picking up points from the massive efforts that were underway across the world. As you said, we all violently agree that action is important. And so, on to our next panel. Regrettably, the person representing the key ministry who is overseeing our international obligations is not able to make it, but we do have the wonderful Charlotte Wolff-bye, Vice President, Chief Sustainable Officer at Petronas, as well as Tuan Syed Feizal, Syed Mohammad, Group Chief Executive Officer of MSM Holdings, a leading sugar producer. Thank you so much, the both of you. Today, we want to talk about mitigation challenges in this panel. We know we are already at 1.45 degrees of warming, with 3 days, I believe, hitting 2 degrees of warming last year. We know that the IPCC works on long-term averages, but we are on the verge of tipping points for multiple slow-moving ecological systems where we don't fully understand the full consequences of. While we are seeing continued momentum on ambition, but lacking detailed policies and plans of actions, we're also seeing increasing complex socio-ecological risks and geopolitical tensions leading to localized impacts, which is affecting us, whether inflation, price volatility, talent scarcity, we're not sufficiently future-proofed, public health capacity is affected, we've got aging, degrading infrastructure as well. So is humanity going to bring disaster upon themselves or transformation upon themselves? Could I invite each of our panelists to share their thoughts, please? Charlotte and then Tuan Syed. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Datin, and thank you very much for having me here today. You're painting a rather bleak picture there. So let's say I'm a bit of a glass half full person. So that's going to be maybe the focus of my remarks. And going back to COP28, it was indeed a very inclusive event. I have attended a number of these events before, and it was very different and gave me a lot of hope. And I think it gave a lot of participants a lot of hope. And why is that? So we had over 100,000 registered representatives from the public and the private sector, non-governmental organizations, international organizations, grassroots movements, academia, and so many more. And these are beyond the negotiators who are busy doing, sort of setting the direction for the future. So why does it matter? Well, because if we want to address climate change, we need to act. We need to deliver on these universally agreed ambitions. And for that, we need a real economy to respond. We need a financial community to embrace it. We need cities, community groups, and so many more to form a common vision of the future that we want and need. And to bring everybody into or allow everybody into the tent is meaningful. So I would say COP28 was encouraging because, as Meena was saying, we live in a very fractious world. but we actually agreed on many, many things that are very, very critical. Is it enough? Is it fast enough and so on? Of course not, but we actually took some meaningful steps. And what was very interesting, I thought that the discussion and the discourse was not just about mitigation and net zero. Now the discussion is about adaptation, nature positive, equitable development, really converging the different agendas, the social, climate, and the nature agendas. And let's see if the UN conventions at some point will merge somehow, because they're obviously now overlapping, because it's a systems issue, it's not just a single issue. So I would say COP28 was indeed a success compared to other COPs. It delivered pragmatic, real economy commitments on emissions, energy efficiency and renewables, finance, and brought many new topics to the table, as we just heard from Dave, such as health and food and agriculture. That's not really been discussed very much before, but food and agriculture contributes 30% of global emissions. And of course, we all need to address climate change. So this was very interesting. And this special emphasis on youth, I thought was very, very encouraging. Now, the private sector was out in big numbers, not seen, I think, since 2015 in Paris. And over 85 billion in public and private finance was announced. Is it enough? Perhaps not, but it certainly is considerably more than before. And the UAE really managed to galvanize a lot of support and put over 30 billion of its own capital on the table. And so I would say it's not enough, but the commitments are much bigger than before. So let's build on that. And of course, the first stock take that we had, the results were out before COP, and we know that we are overshooting all the scientific boundaries. Emissions need to drop by 7% every year, whereas the annual trend is about a 1.5 degrees 1.5 degree increase every year of emissions. So scientists, I think they said that at best, if we use all levers, the overshoot can be limited to 1.8, but not 1.5. So the situation is not great, as Datin you were just saying. But the oil and gas industry did respond, and this matters. So the oil and gas leaders pledged through the Oil and Gas Decarbonization Charter, and basically this covers over 40% of the world's oil and gas production, basically committing to net zero by 2050, with very specific commitments to develop pathways and roadmaps and mitigates, and also to drive down methane emissions to near zero by 2030. That's progress. These were not the usual companies that sort of say these things and have had the mitigation programs in place for decades. There are a lot of new companies involved. So that was really encouraging. That's progress. We've not seen that before. Now for Petronas, this was the OGDC, or the Oil and Gas Decarbonization Charter, is actually fully aligned with our net zero carbon emission pathway that we published back in 2022. Now, to achieve any change that's required, we must change how we produce and consume energy. But the oil and gas producers have such an important role here, but they're only one part of the whole equation. So I thought it was very interesting to see in the final COP agreement specific references to energy transition, energy efficiency, renewables. It was also quite pragmatic about the need for new value chains that need to be developed. They reference carbon capture and storage, hydrogen, nuclear, and other areas. This is very interesting because previously these agreements have not been so precise, if you like. It's been more sort of more at the higher level, if you like. So also I would say that there now is a greater recognition that economic aspects, commerciality, and industrial involvement is critical to address climate change in a way that allows for social progress and uplift. And I do feel that now we need to address climate change in a way that offers hope, economic uplift, and progress. And I think what was notable also in the agreement was that it recognized for the first time, I think sort of more properly or more precisely, the role of the private sector and it highlights the need to strengthen policy guidance, incentives, regulations, and enabling conditions. These are the exact words from the agreement. And also encourages the parties or the countries to continue enhancing these enabling environments. Again, I think this is very encouraging because we can now expect governments and private sector all around the world to work more closely on decarbonization efforts, because one part of society won't be able to deliver everything that's required. We need to work together, try and test various means and efforts and ways. We won't have all the solutions at hand at get-go, so we need to collaborate like never before. And the agreement actually recognized that participation, collaboration needs to happen. And all in all, I think it was good, and now we have to ratchet up. Every country has to ratchet up the nationally determined contributions by COP30 in Brazil by 2025, and or I guess the COP is in 2026. 2025, yes. And for Petronas, we recognize that we have an important role in contributing and to support Malaysia's evolving policies and commitments towards climate change. And I would also say here that the COP28 was constructive, and it's very clear that for countries to be able to deliver towards the agreement, we need to have the ability to build capacity, access finance, and also benefit from technology transfer. And in the oil and gas industry specifically, we have to deliver on our commitments, report on progress openly, and through the Oil and Gas Decarbonization Charter, there was also an element that we're committing to measurement, reporting, and verification of emissions. So that's also very important in earning trust as we're delivering on our emission mitigation. And we would also expect to see more regulation all around the world on energy systems. So to have a proactive stance on reducing emissions will be not just critical for the industry's competitiveness, but also for other industrial sectors, regions, as well as countries. So those would be my remarks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sharon. I particularly like your phrase, we need to collaborate like never before. But that was a really good start. One side, what are your thoughts, especially now that the food sector has come squarely within the targets?
Yeah, so thank you, Datin, for having me. And nice meeting Charlotte too. I think we note of the positives coming out of COP, the address of fossil fuels and the loss and damage and so forth. But I think that my take is that commitments and also policies are just not simply enough. I think that we are in a critical state, of climate change and its impact. I think we are no longer in an if and when scenario. I think, and that is further compounded by the fact that financing gap will hinder climate action. I think consensus are that this financing is still inadequate. So hence, of course, when you talk about food sector, it will relate to food sector as well, food security. Mitigation strategy doesn't reflect the urgency highlighted by the latest IPCC science. That's what some of the opinions of experts. I think we have the technology and science. That's not the issue if you were to apply to food as a sector. But I think political will require greater and importantly unconstrained commitment. So I think that is what's lacking. It's not so much the science and technology. Okay, so that needs to be addressed, as well as corporate will. I think corporate will is lacking. I will speak a bit more about how corporate can play a key role in repositioning within the whole of society approach. So I think corporate will needs a step up. The other I see as important, is the supply chain ecosystem that needs to be inclusive. Yeah, inclusive, especially with respect to the SMEs. That's the backbone to support initiatives and implementation. So for larger corporates like us, that's our scope 3. So without our scope 3, we cannot get to net zero, and especially the scope 3 comprise the SMEs. So while we do our part to educate and bring greater awareness to the SMEs, but I think that we require a wider and a more structured approach to getting all the SMEs on board. So my take is that we need critical thinking. Yeah, we need game-changing policies, and needed to effect rapid and widened action moving forward. So that's my take, Datin.
Thank you so much, Syed. So I wanted to dive a little bit deeper into this, and maybe Charlotte, I want to ask you, how much of a role can policy play even without the availability of climate finance? Because it appears that despite some announcements at COP, it might take a while for the scale of financing to mobilize. So what can we do in the meantime, and especially with policymakers supporting us? What can we do internally?
So thank you very much for that question. Maybe just briefly on climate finance or finance in general, we not all problems can be solved by throwing money at it. I guess that's sort of one point, and we just heard about the will. The will also is very important. But on policy, more importantly, climate change as a matter, it needs to be addressed from top down. And I think this is something that Meena also mentioned, because if we look at other innovations in society, mobile telephony or something like that, it was, of course, it was regulated at some point, but it's not like it was sort of a different style of development, societal development and innovation. This really, climate change must come from the top and be regulated in an effective way. And we've seen this, of course, in countries that have been doing this for a long, long time. And for that, you need clear policy signals and a stable policy environment. And then you get better response from the private sector. When the private sector moves, it means investment. And this matters because no amount of climate finance or bilateral aid or something like that will be enough to fix what we have on our hands here. So we need clear policy signals and as much stability in the policy environment, so that investors can see a return on infrastructure investments that may take years or even decades. To address climate change as well as adaptation, a lot of steel needs to go into the ground. This is real infrastructure. Repurpose existing infrastructure, equally important, especially in countries with existing energy systems. So this is why long-term policy matters and clear policy signals. And the examples around the world, so right now, of course, well, in the European Union since 2005, we have the European Union Emission Trading Scheme. This has been an effective lever to drive energy efficiency in particular. It took a few goes, if you like. It had to be revitalized on a few occasions, but now it is really driving behavior by industry and those who consume energy, but also polluters. In the United States, we have the Inflation Reduction Act. That's very different. So rather than providing a cost on carbon, it provides incentives for investments. But there are many other levers that governments can apply, which is around using tax instruments, align public infrastructure investments and the education system to support new developments. And this is very important for new nascent value chains, because we must promote innovation into the innovation that we require. I would say in the energy systems, much more innovation is required still, not just on the engineering side, but also on the commerciality. We need commercial value chains, otherwise it won't be sustainable. So their policy in the early stage of value chain development, it's quite important to be technology agnostic if you can. Whilst you can incentivize specific technologies, it's still good to keep it open because you allow for greater innovation, because you might not be sure where the sort of silver bullet might come from. But I would highlight that no amount of climate finance will deliver everything we need. It's also a mindset issue. It's a policy issue and a whole of society issue. So we do need markets to respond as well. And then you get this much more virtuous circle.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, we're a small open economy and external factors are so critical. So whether it's investors through the capital markets, trading partners, multinational companies, because we're such a significant player in the global supply chain, that private sector and policymakers need to. And this is the role of organizations like Climate Governance Malaysia, the CU Action Network, to try and provide this voice, which helps with a deeper, more robust consultation process. Thank you so much, Syed. Over to you, Tuan. What are your thoughts? What could we do in the absence of climate finance?
Yeah, of course. I think that strengthening the resilience to water-related climate hazards, attaining, climate resilient food production, and reducing adverse effects on the vulnerable societies. I think that's about like what, 3 billion, over 3 billion vulnerable communities that will face on the front line of climate change. So I think that, and it doesn't mean that the rest are not affected. Everyone has skin in the game, So I think that looking at the widening adaptation finance gap, I think that we need to find the alternatives. To my mind, I think that 3 areas, when you pose me these questions, I think that 3 areas we could look at is that firstly, the whole of society approach. I touched this again, and this is where the repositioning, I think, is important. What I mean by this is that there's so much government can do, and hopefully that they subscribe fast enough. But I think that the corporate, who are the natural emitters, are the natural ones to mitigate. Okay, so we've got to put the corporates in the lead position, right? So how do we do this? So I think this is important to recognize that corporates need to take the lead. If I were to use the analogy of the Tour de France, the yellow jersey, right? At some point, the yellow jersey needs to be passed on to the next leader, yeah, in that race. So now the corporate will have to don that yellow jersey. So, but on the levers of policies. So where government can come in to help with the corporate stewardship, I think, is by providing unlimited incentives. Why limit incentives in the first place? When you are in a critical state, we are all in a critical state, right? So it's not going to damage the economy. It's going to save the economy. I think that thinking needs to change. So firstly, I'm a proponent of unlimited incentives, meaning corporate can use their resources, okay, as much as corporate can invest, whether it's nature-based solutions, whether it's RE, and so forth, energy efficient systems, buildings. I think that government should just encourage and mute that kind of thinking in order to set an example and bring that sort of example across to the next COP. Okay, so I think that unlimited incentives is one of the areas that I think is needed, and that will cause that yellow jersey effect of repositioning in the whole of society approach. And with that also, it's not just about incentives, but I think we need, on the flip side, we need to think about the stick as well. Okay, for the laggards, okay? Second, I think, is to democratize mitigation. So actions wider through, for example, crowdsourcing solutions, leveraging climate platforms. So you rightly mentioned, Datin, about CU Action Network, CGM, and so forth. So I think these are already very established, and I would say world-class organizations that where we can leverage the corporate world to take that lead action. Third, I will say that there's still significant gaps in appreciation for climate action, okay, due to lack of urgency. So this is where education awareness of climate change and impact to business needs to be put across very strongly, and also in a very concerted and structured manner. So I think this is where I think the larger corporates, while they pay closer attention to issues like climate action and ESG, but I think the SMEs, so I reiterate that the SMEs, the backbone of the economy, are far lagging. Of course, in MSM, for example, we are doing our best to educate our Scope 3 participants, to make them understand that their Scope 1 and Scope 2 is equal to our Scope 3. So we have a structured program in educating them, and we'll be happy to share across with others. So this is where peer-to-peer network across platforms of whether it's a CAN or CGM, that we can try to work closely. So I think collaboration, partnerships, synergies are needed to quickly bring everyone on board. So
Thank you.
yeah, so just to close, I think that and even bring in the banking circles, bring in the banking circles in this, because why? If you think about it, almost always an SME is linked to a bank. Okay, so I think that we've got to create synergies with the bank to educate sustainability within the SMEs. Okay, so these are some of the areas that I wanted to bring about. Datin.
Yeah, thank you so much. We're getting questions in the chat box and some very thoughtful points. So please take a look at it, and in your responses, try to address this as well. So for example, why are we looking at 1.5 degrees of warming and not the carbon budget, for example, allocation of the remaining carbon budget? Tuan Syed, you've already responded to MSM's role in the SMEs. Unlimited incentives, of course, that my eyebrows went up as well. So maybe in your response later, you might want to flesh that out a little bit more. The investigation in mitigation could be wiped out by climate impacts. That's also an excellent point. That how climate resilient are you? In your risk register, each of your physical assets might appear to be have low exposure to extreme weather events. But if we don't invest in adaptation, then indirect physical risk could impact this as well. So let's move on to our next question. Well, you keep this in mind in your response. We seem to be, post-industrial revolution. We have developed economies and improved lifestyles, and we've taken millions out of poverty, but on the back of our seeming addiction to fossil fuels, energy, and the attendant subsidies. So how do we tackle our seeming addiction to energy, and especially this part of the world, which is the factory for the world, despite understanding the criticality of reducing emissions? How are we going to balance this? Charlotte, could I leave this with you to unpack for us? Thank you.
I think this is $1 million question, Datin. I don't think I have even half a response, and I guess the whole of the COP is around this. How do we unravel an energy system that's been built we've been building for the last 150 years, and that's created a lot of growth, but also at the expense of the environment. Now, an altruistic agenda goes only so far, and won't mainstream decarbonization sufficiently. So it's very good to have good examples of good actions happening and collaborations, but they need to be replicable and scaled up if possible. Otherwise, they're only examples. And that's why markets are quite effective in that sense. So if it's cheaper to drive an electric scooter versus a petrol-powered scooter, you would probably go for the electric one. That's kind of how economies tend to work. So what type of policy intervention, innovation, private sector investment is required to make that shift? I think that's really critical. And we see this in different parts of the world. So the world is not uniform, but in some parts of the world, solar and wind are really moving ahead as viable sources of energy. And I think the European Union last year, for the first time, had over 50% of in electricity came from renewable sources. That's not applicable perhaps for all parts of the world, but there are really is when the price is right, things will move across the whole economy. But of course, on top of that, you do need education of everybody from school children to business. We heard SMEs, but also big business. So everything needs to kind of happen at once, because we don't have time to waste here. So I'm sorry, hard to unpick this, but we had 100,000 people at COP, and some of those conclusions were presented by Dave, which I feel are meaningful contributions going forward. But of course, everything together is just not enough. We need
Absolutely. And at CGM, we've got almost 6,000 subscribers to our newsletter, and they're actively participating. And you'll see the quality of the questions that we're getting. These are intelligent, thoughtful, deep-thinking people who want to be part of the solution. Tuan Syed, over to you. Aside from unlimited incentives. What else can we do?
Yeah, so I think that approaching energy and getting less of an addiction, I think we've got to look at a multi-dimensional approach. So combining energy efficiency, education, behavioral change, policy instruments, of course, and also investments in the necessary renewable agency research, innovation, synergies, partnerships, and inclusive approaches. Inclusive approaches are also where I touch again upon the communities. So I think that when we take decisions, I think we should also have that inclusive approach. Then it becomes meaningful when we speak about whole of society. Okay, so I think that promoting energy efficiency, I think that's important. In MSM, for example, we are dependent on fossil fuel. We are one of the largest, so I think corporates need to assess options. So MSM, for example, we are fully dependent on gas. Of course, short of addiction, though, but it's driven by need. Yeah, because steam is at the heart of sugar refinery, and we use gas to produce the steam. And that's supplied directly by Petronas. So we are among the top users of the country. However, when the prices of gas started to increase over the last, when I came in CEO in MSM in February 21, it was something like 25 ringgit per MMBTU. Today, we are speaking of close to double. So, and that's 40% of refining costs. So it drives you, the need has also driven us to rethink about our dependency on fossil fuels. So I think that one natural, let's say, alternative that we will be embarking will be biomass. So biomass based on PKS or either EFBs, palm-based, that will be something that we look forward to implementing within 2.5 years from now. And we are in close discussions with the Economic Planning Unit on this as well, as part of their phase 2 identification of projects. And here I would like also that it was unfortunate that the government representation was not here this morning. But I would like to suggest that, for the materials needed for renewables within the country, I think they put a moratorium, a ban on exports. And I would, if I had the opportunity, I would immediately ban the exports of PKS and EFB to allow greater opportunity for renewable energy-based power generation. I did mention this anyway to the Economic Planning Unit, so I think YB Rafizi has taken note of this. I think it's just a matter of time. And of course, solar. So I think everybody has a rooftop, whether small or large. So we're going to embark on installing solars on our warehouses, which is a fairly large warehouse in MSM Pride, for example, and in Sungai Buloh, and later look at Johor. So I think that why not? Okay, why not? So I think there's enough rooftops across the countries that I think that we should embark upon.
Thank you.
So these are alternatives, or let's say, towards reducing our dependency on fossil fuels. Okay, Datin?
Thank you so much. Thank you. I think that was a really good set of thoughts, actions that we could take into account. In the remaining few minutes that we have, I just wanted to throw this question to the both of you. What ambition would you like to see from the policymakers in the run-up to Baku and Belem? What are your thoughts, Charlotte and Tuan?
So I think this goes for policymakers and everybody else. So we've had current policy scenarios. I think what's so interesting about COP also, you get all these analytics firms and non-governmental organizations like analyzing all the results and what would it mean and all of that. And I think you mentioned a question there about why we're focusing on a temperature when it's about gigatons and all those very valid debates also at the COP arena. The current policy, I think, scenario for 2030, so where the countries have committed to, it's not sufficient at all to meet the climate ambitions stated in the Paris Agreement. But what's interesting is that if we would actually deliver on those policies, we would go quite some way. Now, what's interesting at COP28, and why I do feel that it was more successful than previous COPs, is that outside of the negotiations, there was more than 4.5 gigatons of CO or carbon dioxide equivalent removal initiatives, if you like. So the private sector and other entities, cities and financiers got into these voluntary commitments and initiatives that would deliver an additional 4.5 gigatons of reductions. And I think Dave mentioned some of those in his presentation. So unfortunately, that still leaves us with a 21 gigaton gap, but it's more than before. And I know we don't have time to waste, but if we deliver on all of those pledges in a transparent way, hopefully that will snowball. And then I think also policymakers will be more open to drive more progressive policy, because I think we heard at the beginning, there's a bit of a challenge right now politically around the world in support of the green movement. And one of the reasons, I'm sure there's many reasons, but one of the reasons is that not all policy instruments are so helpful for the population. There's an affordability issue, and then you get a response in the political process. So hopefully, if we all deliver on the pledges that we have now, that are obviously not enough, but once we get going and our approaches mature, I hope, and I do believe, I mean, this is innovation curves, all of these things, we will be able to snowball and have much bigger impact, and more progressive policy will follow. So do what we promised to do, and be open about the results and the progress we're making. I think will go a long way. That's what I would expect. And a year is a long time in climate change, so we need to move quickly.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Charlotte. Tuan Syed?
Yeah, so Datin, a run up to Baku, I guess COP what, 29? So I think 3 areas I could suggest as a run up to Baku. I think firstly, I think that there should be some thinking around regional COPs, not just a global central COP. So I think where regional COP could look into data specifics, commitments, and monitoring, which could also be regions purpose fit. For example, an ASEAN COP could be carved out to address the region and towards global commitments. So I think this is taking upon once you did highlight to me the vision of doing an ASEAN level sustainability conference. So thinking through that, Datin, I think that's a good vision. And I think that why not make it as a kind of a sub-COP where it's region specific. And I think ASEAN has a strong collective voice, leveraging on the 600, 700 million people in the region. I think then that could lead also to bringing about more effective resolutions as a voice, as a collective voice. So that will be one of the suggestions. The other is that the NDCs, I think you've heard me also in the past. The NDCs, I believe that there's not enough commitments by the governments. You have those who have submitted, and you have the legates. So why have the legates? Okay, so I think that it's time that we need some game-changing, transformative policies or actions. And I think this is where the NDCs pledge at IPCCs need to be linked to sovereign ratings. So sovereign rating agencies such as Moody's, S&P's, and Fitch, I think need to also work with the IPCCs in tandem, and not just look at political and economic factors when doing their sovereign ratings, but also look into the level of progress and pledges of the NDCs. So I think that this is super important, because otherwise you will have a very low or slow subscription of countries. I'm not sure, for example, where Malaysia is on their NDC. So however, this linking the NDCs to sovereign ratings will not be punishing. I think it will only be helping, right? And when you look at it, it will be more so for the biggest emitters. And who are the biggest emitters? The major economies. So I think it will be less punishing onto the developing countries. So I think that sovereign ratings will cost if you were a laggard. But at the same time, you can look at the COP can also look at incentivizing those who are ahead, and there are some countries who are already ahead, and some are doing very well on that front. The other is that I believe there's an elephant in the room not being addressed at COP. Okay, finally we heard the fossil fuel industry being addressed after many years of getting away with an address. I think now the elephant in the room is the weapons industry and wars, as mentioned by Meena just now in some of her opening remarks. That I think that this needs to be addressed. Global experts have assessed that it's about 5.5% of carbon emission from this industry. And when you have unnecessary or even fake wars, so to speak, then you have again setback on climate action. So I think this needs to be addressed at the next COP. And maybe this is where, if we were looking at human rights and those sort of aspects, then it could be a collective ASEAN voice as a resolution in a run-up to Baku. That's my take, Datin.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tuan Syed. I'm sure everyone in this room agrees with me that we've had an excellent panel. Thank you for all of your thoughts. We really appreciate it. I'm very grateful. I now have the great pleasure of handing over to Dato Faiz for the next panel, and then to close off this webinar, which he will do. But before that, if I just share a few thoughts. I deliberately hadn't included myself as a speaker today because we really wanted to hear from all of you. But someone reminded me last September that she heard me speak 4 years ago when I said that every breath we have is on trust, Amana. So I wanted to take this opportunity to remind us all, your life is only a combination of time and energy, and both are dissipating every single day. So we're living in this narrow window of opportunity, rapidly closing, to transform the way we live, which will prove to be a reset of the entire industrial base on which the modern economy is built on. This will also present huge opportunities for those who seize this. So I hope you all feel inspired to take action listening to our speakers today. Thank you so much. Over to you, Dato Faiz, for the next panel session.
Thank you, Datin.
Thank you, Datin, and to the previous panel. I guess we've spent a fair bit of time talking about, firstly, the problem, the mitigation that's needed, and also where COP28 has got us to. And some of the points raised, particularly by Tuan Syed, resonate, right? Which is that it is a whole of society approach. We shouldn't be relying purely on the government to come up with solutions and things. But I think the thing that keeps on coming out from both speakers and even some of the things that were said by Meera and all that is it comes down to money. So this panel is going to now kind of look at a specific part of that little need for money part, which is adaptation. So we talked about mitigation. We've kind of mentioned resilience in the conversation, but adaptation is basically, essentially getting used to it being hot. What do we need to do to prepare for that? So for that, we've got three speakers, Mr. Darshan Joshi from the Penang Institute, Alizan Mahadi from the UNDP, and of course, the good thing about being a keynote speaker is you can be brought back again. So we're getting Dave Sivaprasad just to kind of end that panel. And really what we're trying to explore is, essentially where are we on adaptation, particularly when you look at it from a Malaysian context. So I gather that Darshan will look at it slightly wider, which is COP28 and so on. Alizan will kind of narrow down a little bit more to what we're seeing in Malaysia. And I hope that all three panelists in their comments will be able to address what are the building blocks that the country needs to put in place in order to be able to assess the need, i.e., what do we need to do for that adaptation and how much money is it going to need? And then the next question being, what's best practice? What should the government be doing with this information? How much should be raised through the markets? How much should be done by them? And so on and so forth. So with that brief introduction, I'd like to invite Darshan to share his views. Darshan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Dato Faiz, and thank you to Datin, Sunita, and Climate Governance Malaysia for giving me this platform to share my thoughts on COP28 and the outcomes. I just want to check that my slides can be seen on the screen.
Yes, you can.
Perfect. Okay, so just very briefly, I'll cover 4 topics. The first is just looking at COP28, the good and the bad. Second, I'll try and contextualize some of the outcomes with regard to Malaysia. Next, I'll talk a bit about carbon pricing, and then we'll have a very brief slide on what's next. So looking at COP28 in isolation, and first of all, the good news. The first observation, obviously, that many people have had is that coal is on the way out, and there have been many more signatories to the Powering Past Coal Alliance, which is intended to support the phase out of coal on a global level. There was also the initiation of the Coal Transition Accelerator, which seeks to assist financing of the low carbon energy transition across the world, particularly in developing countries. Second, and perhaps there's some evidence against this as well, but the Global South has, in hosting the last COP and the next COP and holding leadership roles in the G20 and G7, perhaps there's a greater role for the Global South to play in these discussions moving forward. And many of the outcomes of COP28, even if they didn't go far enough, have set the stage to support the Global South in mitigation and adaptation efforts. This has been touched on before, but there's enhanced financing instruments or mechanisms for climate action, most notably being the Loss and Damage Fund and also the Global Biodiversity Framework Fund. There have been also greater financing commitments for the Green Climate Fund, the Adaptation Fund, Least Developed Countries Fund, and Special Climate Change Fund. Finally, there was also a declaration on global climate finance framework led by the UAE, UK, and US, which seeks to assist developing countries' energy transition efforts. This has also been raised before, but there have been very now famous headline targets to triple the renewable energy capacity by 2030 and double energy efficiency enhancement rates, which is always a positive. And another thing that I've noted is that there have been quite a number of measures introduced to try and curb GHG emissions across a wide range of sectors, including transboundary sectors like shipping and aviation, but also the hard to abate sectors like heavy industry. There are also targets to enhance nuclear capacity and hydrogen capacity as well. And then many efforts across buildings, construction, and oil and gas as well, which are all positive steps. And many of these initiatives seem to be private sector or industry led, which can signal robust buy-in from them rather than leaning on governments to try and drive these changes. Unfortunately, there was also some bad, and some of these points have already been raised as well. The first thing being weakened language. We've moved from a phase out of coal and fossil fuels to a phase down and now to transitioning away. Surely this is great for the Global South, who, there's still economic incentives to use fossil fuels to support our broader economic development objectives. But why is there, for instance, no differentiation in language for the developed world who have already historically used fossil fuels to get to a level of development that us as Malaysia and other Southeast Asian countries are striving towards? So, and this also has broader implications for global climate change mitigation as a whole, where you're trying to reduce global emissions, but we're giving the same leeway to developed countries to transition away from fossil fuel consumption. So that was probably one of the bigger disappointments of COP28. There was also a lack of progress and emphasis on carbon pricing. And I take note that there was a new integrity framework that was developed to help standardize credit standards and so on. But in terms of operationalization of Article 6.4 in particular, there was not much progress that was made. And of course, no progress towards the establishment of a global carbon price, which, at least theoretically speaking, is a prerequisite for fully addressing the externality effects that are leading to climate change. And there's also the fact that carbon prices have to rise significantly in order to limit global warming to 2 degrees Celsius. On the side of financing, we've established now a few new mechanisms and gotten more pledges for financial support to the developing world, but the financing still remains heavily insufficient, and there's still a significant climate gap for us to accelerate the energy transition, but also to enhance adaptation and resilience efforts, particularly in the developing world. Another thing I'd like to note is that, this was also sort of headline news, but it seems as though the anti-climate lobbying is now happening in full force, and a record number of lobbyists were at COP28, more than any single country's delegation, and that's just something to keep in mind, where these conferences are typically, well, in their purest form, supposed to be for countries to take stock of the latest in climate science and come together to come up with policy responses to a very difficult challenge. But not everyone may have the same motives at these conferences themselves. And then finally, just to bring things back to reality, greenhouse gas emissions continue to rise. We're on track to reach 1.5 C in probably the next few years. Paris, meanwhile, called for a limit of well below 2 degrees Celsius, with the aim really being 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2100. We're 70-odd years ahead of this. And with existing policies like Dave highlighted before, we are going to reach 2.9 degrees Celsius. So, there's quite a marked disparity between our targets and what we're actually achieving in reality. And we've also witnessed over the past year or the past few years that, the frequency and scale of climate-related disasters is rising. It's disproportionately affecting less developed countries, vulnerable populations. So that's just in the background. I'll move on now to the Malaysian contextualization. And first, I'll start with a review of the state of emissions in Malaysia. So total GHG emissions in Malaysia continue to rise from 250 million tons of CO2 a year to 330. Also recognizing that this is a small percentage of the global fossil fuel consumption. And in Malaysia, we were net zero back in 2000, but then we started burning coal to generate power, and we've tracked away from that net zero target, which we're now trying to reach again by 2050. And much of the increase in our emissions is driven, again, like I said, by electricity consumption. You can see the gray line in the bottom diagram here, that has risen quite dramatically, even compared to industries like transport and industry. In terms of emissions reductions, and this information is from Malaysia's biennial update report, we see quite a significant increase in emissions reductions from things like renewable energy efficiency in transport, and also oil and gas, whereas there might be some more scope for improvement in terms of our emissions from the waste sector and IPDU and agriculture. Next, to look at some of the policies that Malaysia has embarked on in the last almost 15 years now. I wanted to try and distinguish between, what is adaptation focused and what is mitigation focused. And when I was going through these policies and instruments, it's clear that most of them are mitigation focused. If you look at the instruments on the bottom, a huge chunk of them are energy sector focused mitigation instruments, things like the Green Technology Financing Scheme, the Green Investment Tax Allowance, and things like that. Lately, we've seen some instruments introduced that could have co-benefits across both adaptation and mitigation, including the ecological fiscal transfers, the voluntary carbon market, and also the 12th Malaysia Plan highlighted, things like carbon pricing instruments and payments for ecosystem services, which also can have co-benefits across both mitigation and adaptation. But by and large, thus far, Malaysia's policies and instruments have been focused quite heavily on mitigation. So clearly more emphasis is needed on adaptation, but noting everything that's ongoing right now and all the efforts that the government of Malaysia is embarking on right now, it is clear that this current emphasis on mitigation, where it's mostly focused on the energy sector, is broadening. So if I just draw your attention to the supporting policies, instruments, and targets, the NRES is developing both the NDC roadmap, which will chart our strategies for meeting our NDCs by 2030, and also our long-term low emissions development strategies, which chart the path to net zero by 2050. The National Energy Transition Roadmap was launched last year and introduced quite significant targets, 70% renewable energy by 2050. A carbon tax and domestic ETS are now under study by the Ministry of Finance and NRES respectively. 12th Major Plan, as I mentioned, highlighted plans to expand ecological fiscal transfers, and we're already seeing this play out today, and also to introduce payments for ecosystem services programs, which can both help to drive financing and funding towards conservation and preservation of natural resources and assets. And then we've also set a carbon neutrality target for 2050. In addition to this, there are a few renewable energy and related energy sector targets, which I'm sure many are familiar with. Another important development is that, the National Adaptation Plan is in development by NRES now, and hopefully we'll see that in the next year or two, which will, take stock of where we're at and what actions we can and should take to enhance our resilience. But the NDC and biennial update reports do note, the need to invest in water resources management, coastal resources, agriculture, and so on to help us on the way to enhancing our resilience. And then finally, on Article 6, the government is still assessing the use of the voluntary cooperation mechanisms under Article 6 to help achieve NDCs, or perhaps to attract funding to support the development of nature-based solutions in the country. And there's also a national carbon policy that's in development, which should at the very least help to elucidate some of the challenges between, for example, state and federal coordination when it comes to carbon credits and selling of these credits, and meeting our NDCs and so on. So there's basically a lot that's going on right now that will help Malaysia evolve in terms of its climate response. Next, I just want to very briefly touch upon carbon pricing, my pet topic, and probably the elephant in the room in Dubai. So, we in previous COPs, this sort of framework of Article 6 had been fleshed out in more detail, where Article 6.2 was established to allow countries to trade credits, either bilaterally or multilaterally, and then purchasing countries can count them towards NDCs, and they're correspondingly adjusted on the selling country's balance sheet. So this way this could help, countries support each other towards mitigation and adaptation objectives by creating demand for carbon credits. Where we were hoping for more progress was on Article 2 side, where we were looking towards the creation of like a centralized marketplace administered by the UN towards allowing public and private actors to collaboratively achieve emissions reductions. So there was a lack of progress in this regard at COP28. And, it's important that steps are taken towards addressing this, because carbon finance can help to unlock a lot of funding for, areas that are historically underfunded, like forest conservation, forest preservation, because we're always faced with incentives to develop these resources to generate revenues. But, this is one argument against exploitation of resources, is to monetize it, and the carbon sequestration potential of natural assets is one aspect towards that. And the reason it was quite disappointing is because, as I mentioned, there were high expectations for Article 6 at COP28 based on progress that was made in previous COPs. At the same time, many countries are introducing their own domestic carbon taxes or emissions trading systems. There were 12 in place in 2012, and there were over 70 last year. And as I'll show in the next slide, many CPIs are in various stages of implementation, including in Southeast Asia. And at the same time, another part of the backdrop was that carbon credit issuances have been growing over the years. From 2014 to 2021, they more than doubled. Much of the demand for credits is driven by corporate commitments, of which there are more and more each year. But at the same time, there are also challenges that need to be addressed, and many things that have come up in the news lately about, lack of robust baselines, harm done to local communities as a result of carbon credit projects, a lack of permanence in some projects, which has really dented confidence in carbon credit markets. During
Darshan, if you could perhaps wrap up in the next 2 minutes or so.
Okay, absolutely. Sorry for that. I'll just touch on this slide, then I'll close up. So basically, there was a failure to agree on a new rulebook for a centralized offset system. There was a deal negotiated, but rejected because it was deemed that the EU's demand for really high standards for the offsetting system would be onerous and restrictive for developing countries. So perhaps that's a good thing that we didn't quite come to a deal yet, but hopefully it's something that can be addressed next year this year in Azerbaijan. I'm just going to leave it there and pass it back to you, Dave. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just a quick question. I mean, you mentioned the National Adaptation Plan by NRES. Is there a deadline as to when they're going to come up with this?
Not that I know personally. All I know is that it'll be in the next couple of years.
So, okay, because that obviously has a consequential impact, right? Because you don't know how much you need to be able to do all these things.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's move on to our next speaker, Encik Alizan. Encik Alizan, over to you.
Thank you, Dato Faiz. Thank you, CGM, Datin Sunita, and CGM for inviting UNDP for this conversation today. Now, I'll focus on a few areas, which, as Dato, you laid it out well. When we talk about adaptation, there's two ways to look at it. First is adapting to the transition that we are facing. So this relates more to the transition risks. But secondly is adaptation in the context of climate change adaptation itself, which is as opposed to looking into mitigation. So I'll speak a bit in that context on some of the key areas that emerged in COP28. Many that have been mentioned already by the previous speakers. The first one is on the just transition. This is looking into, again, adapting to this transition, looking into what transpired in terms of climate change adaptation, and also what has emerged more and more is the link between climate and nature, which has co-benefits between mitigation and adaptation. Now, again, just transition has already been highlighted quite a few times by speakers, but the UAE consensus does highlight transitioning away from fossil fuels must be done in a just, orderly, and equitable manner. So within the transitioning away from fossil fuels, there is a just transition built into it. And also, as Meena mentioned earlier, there's a just transition work program that is being planned and agreed. But at the international level, when we talk about this just transition, much of the focus was on finance, rightly so, as negotiations in Dubai, although there was some increased pledges, they continue to fall short on what most nations identify, especially developed nations, that they need sufficient finance to allow them to meet needs and carry out climate action at the level of ambition that is necessary. As I said, climate resources did not increase dramatically, and the critical issue of freeing up sufficient finance to address climate crisis it was kind of deferred to the next year. And again, Meena already mentioned this, which is quite important, is the new quantified goal on climate finance, which will be discussed in Baku. There were new pledges, for example, to the Green Climate Fund, which its second replenishment comes up to about 13 billion. So there is some promising news there. But again, when we talk about looking into climate finance, we can't wait for another year. We can't wait for Baku. The investments need to happen now. And this includes for both international finance as well as domestic finance. There is a real urgency for a surge in finance, whether this be for mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, or in terms of institutionally reforming the overall international financial architecture. In the context of Malaysia, I guess it's been brought up in the previous session, Malaysia is an upper middle income country. And while we do still have access to international public finance, more and more we are a net negative recipient of official development assistance. We cannot rely on international finance wholly. And this comes to the first practical solution that you wanted to discuss a bit, is that I would recommend one of the key areas moving forward is really focusing on climate finance and more specifically on, especially when Dave brought this up, really looking into blended financing, where we can utilize concessional capital to catalyze further investments and crowd-in investments, and combining public and private capital to amplify the impact of climate-related projects. Now, leveraging public funds to attract private capital can provide a much-needed boost to projects that address climate change challenges and will offer also a return on investment. In Malaysia, we have a sophisticated and mature financial industry, so we can lead this discussion globally. Of course, we are leaders also in Islamic finance and value-based intermediation, but also, I think more importantly, at the domestic level, we begin implementation, begin looking into the designs, the structures. They will be contextual. It'll be unique in accordance with the projects, but I think we have the capacity to be moving forward on this. Beyond finance, for Malaysia, when you talk about just transition and just energy transition, most of the focus has been on of course, the shift within the energy sector, the impact on the workforce, and so on and so forth. And I think, of course, that is very important. It makes sense. There's also been a focus on SMEs, again, which make up about 97% of business establishments in Malaysia, almost 40% of our GDP. And UNDP, for example, is looking into supporting this idea of sustainable value chains. But I think there needs to be a broader look when we talk about just transition. Firstly, not just the energy sector, not just the just energy transition, but a just transition in general. So this just transition looks into the overall socioeconomic impact of this transition at the national level. Many countries are looking at this at a macroeconomic perspective. For example, UNDP globally, we're supporting Serbia, Costa Rica, Zimbabwe, which are building economic models actually looking into these transitions and looking into the impacts of various investments in this green transition. And this information is also helping to identify targeted measures for vulnerable populations such as women and informal workers. So I think, especially in a country that relies significantly in terms of our government revenue in the oil and gas sector, we need to look at it economy-wide, what this just transition means. Institutionally as well, there are many countries now that have established national transition commissions, task forces, dialogues, and this is one other idea that we may want to consider to set up a sort of commission for a just transition. Finally, on just transition, I think it does need to be linked to adaptation as well. For example, in the region in Asia, 30% of employment is derived from the agriculture sector. So in these countries, scaled up climate adaptation approaches such as conservation agriculture can actually have a higher job multiplier and produce other social benefits as well. So in my first segment on just transition, moving forward, firstly is, I think, looking into the blended finance mechanism. And the second solution I would say here is to have a broad plan for just transition for Malaysia, which is not targeted only on the energy sector, but across various sectors, across mitigation and adaptation, and addresses economy-wide issues and especially vulnerable populations. My second part is really around adaptation itself. I won't repeat some of the quite significant outcomes of COP28 when it comes to adaptation, the loss and damage fund, the global goal for adaptation. But I'll just go briefly in the context of Malaysia and moving forward. I think loss and damage, Malaysia actually played quite a key role within the discussions globally. And while this should continue, there needs to be more focus on what we will do within Malaysia when it comes to loss and damage. When it comes to the global goal on adaptation, some of the COP28 outcomes include for all countries to have adaptation plans. Darshan already brought this up. Dato, I know that the government, I won't speak for the government, but I know that they are in the process of getting this off the ground, the National Adaptation Plan. And hopefully we will at least kick off the process soon and we will have a National Adaptation Plan. But let me diverge a bit from that. I mean, the urgency of adaptation is already feeling it now. I think everyone knows this. In the context of Malaysia, there's floods, this is a year of El Nino. There probably will be droughts where farmers will be suffering. So there needs to be both solutions on the ground as well as crowdsourced solutions to first of all understand the issue. And here I would like to compliment the efforts made by CGM, actually, Dato Sunita, who's looking into setting up a climate dashboard, which would at least provide information on for decision makers, whether that be planners, producers, or consumers themselves. For example, if you wanted to develop an area, is it in a flood-prone area? In 30 years, will it be affected by climate change? Would you buy that house if you were a consumer? So on and so forth. So we need more and more of this information, which is crowdsourced, and CGM is also leading the way in this. But also, more practically as well, is when we talk about adaptation, and Dato, you mentioned everything needs money, and a lot of adaptation relates to risk. And many of these risks are quite significant risks. And therefore, of course, how do you address risk is usually through insurance. But this is an area where, the risk is very high. We talk about farmers, for example. They don't have it's not affordable for farmers to take up the risk. So that's my next practical recommendation, is for the government to really look into how this risk can be shared. And there are various tools now available. For example, I think in Vietnam and Indonesia, where at the district level, the district governments, they actually take up the insurance, which could be taken up at scale for the whole district. And then you can have an arrangement with the farmers, whether they pay a kind of a subsidized fee or something, and so on. And then it can be paid out according to climate matrices or something along those lines. So it does exist. And I think in Malaysia, while we wait for this national adaptation plan, I think we need to really go into these solutions for financing as well. Sorry, I'll speed up a bit. My final part is on climate action. The link we have seen in COP28 is getting more and more linked with nature, and I think this is a positive development. For the first time, the text stressed the need to halt and reverse forest loss by 2030, and also for the first time, it notes the need for more investment in results-based finance. This basically is calling out to what's known as REDD+ framework. So this sends a positive signal through the various issues do remain, some which relates to carbon trading that I won't cover. Darshan already mentioned, including the Article 6. But I think in the context of Malaysia, more broadly speaking, this is an opportunity for Malaysia to really look into, especially for those who were there in COP28, we realized there was a lot of side events, a lot of activity around high integrity carbon market when it comes to forestry. I think many probably have read or know about the article by Guardian, which really asked about the integrity of the carbon market, especially when it comes to forestry. So there's a lot of focus in terms of high integrity carbon markets. And in the context of Malaysia, Malaysia does have a relatively good track record when it comes to sustainable forest management. And although Malaysia is not the largest country in terms of forests, for example, Brazil, Indonesia, Congo, so on and so forth, Malaysia actually has a better reputation when it comes to, and a better opportunity when it comes to having a high integrity carbon market, which also should mean that it's higher value as well. So I think this is another practical recommendation which Malaysia should really be leading this space. And in particular, this is important because the COP30 will be held in Brazil. We all know Lula will be championing this issue. So starting from now, Malaysia should really prepare ourselves to be one of the leaders when it comes to the high integrity carbon market value. And of course, Darshan, Meena also highlighted there are challenges when it comes to offsets, etc., that we should be aware. But if we were to go into the carbon market and forestry, it should be high integrity. Final point, as a summary, one of the outcome, not really outcome of COP28, but the process over the next 2 years, the governments will prepare the third round of the National Determined Contributions, NDC, and often there would be a push to raise ambition. So this is a process that I hope multi-stakeholders will be involved to really craft our next or level up our climate ambition in Malaysia and pursue our own path, including mitigation and adaptation as well. And UNDP, we have a program, Climate Promise. We're here to support this transition. Thank you, Dato.
Thanks, Alizan. I see there's a question to you from Emily. How can we speed up the on-the-ground adaptation financing alternatives like the one you suggested for farmers? Do you think that state governments are in the best position to facilitate this? And how would the private sector play a role in this?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is exactly within the question. We need various stakeholders to be involved. We need people who, insurance practitioners, companies. It could be state, it could be federal, it could be district, and we need a real education and awareness program for the farmers themselves as well, because it might still require a certain amount of payment, so on and so forth. So it will require a lot of coordination. It will take time, but whatever it is, I think we need to start it straight away. Especially, probably the most urgent is actually pushing the demand for it, which is from the farmers. I mean, that quickly, for example, I've worked on the ground quite a lot, and many farmers have already highlighted that of course they don't call it climate change, but the seasons are changing, shorter seasons and so on. So to push for that demand, well, in parallel with the other actors as well, I think would speed up the process.
So thank you for that. So it's interesting to me that pretty much every insurance policy has an act of God clause that says they're not covered because it's an act of God. So since we've now, we've established that much of what we're seeing is actually man-made, maybe that clause shouldn't be invoked so much. But of course, but you're right. I mean, I'm only aware of maybe Japan that has weather derivatives. It isn't really there yet, in terms of pricing the risk of crop failures and what have you. Okay, so it's now 12:18. We have about 12 minutes left. I appreciate Dave is on the move somewhere. Dave, do you have any comments to add on to what you've heard so far, particularly about adaptation and I guess climate finance keeps on coming up?
Yeah, no, thanks, Dato, Faiz and Alizan and Darshan. Well, maybe I'll just add a couple of thoughts on the role of the private sector and private interests, right? So often you hear the story of is there a business case for the private sector to invest in adaptation? Now, I mean, it's certainly a challenge in mitigation as well, when the private sector needs to think about the potential of suboptimal returns in the near term, but potentially higher returns in the long term. Now, if you take a leaf from this and you say, so what's the incentive for the private sector to invest? There's a lot of work done, by the World Bank, others, BCG has also done that with USAID on, what's the cost benefit for the private sector, right? And, when you look at it from the point of view of, these physical risks and hazards, have direct impact on supply chains, have direct impact on physical assets that companies will, operate. In fact, if you go to consumer goods, you see, heat impact, for example, changing consumer patterns, right? So all of these have direct, commercial implications for companies. And even by the most conservative measures, they point to cost-benefit ratios of investment to protection of returns and protection of cash flows and balance sheet protection in the 2 to 10 times range, right? That's what the numbers show. Now, then you ask the question, why do the private sector not mobilize around this? I think it's a number of factors. One is, some of these risks and exposures are not understood. So there is a level of, private sector players getting much more down to down to the ground to understand what is the impact, bringing the climate science and downscaling it to your supply chains, to your assets, and understanding those impacts and getting an appreciation of what does it mean for your commercial interests. And the second is that for the longest time this is viewed as this is something that's going to happen in 2040, 2050, right? So the incentives are not aligned. So if you're a management team looking at the next 5-year plan, the chances you deploying capital in adaptation is probably quite low relative to other things. But we're seeing today that the short and mid-term incentives are starting to align, right? I mean, these impacts are happening at a higher frequency and at a higher severity than even what was predicted. So the combination of understanding the impacts and understanding that it's happening faster than we thought should be a increasing incentive for the private sector. Now, then let me convert it to a couple of specific examples. These are widely quoted examples that are public. So for example, EDC in the Philippines was facing severe impact on its generation fleet because of extreme weather events, and invested in adaptation to strengthen its assets with green financing to support it, because these incentives were starting to align with what is needed for adaptation. Similarly, we've seen with consumer good companies where they're highly reliant on the upstream supply chains for agriculture to serve their production needs, where investing in the upstream of their supply chain for adaptation is in their commercial interest, and it's also in the interest of the farmers, right? So I think we're starting to see signals. It is certainly not as large and as widespread as what is needed. But here's where the glass half full. As Charlotte was saying, I share that sentiment. It is important to also magnify some of these positive examples and signals. The final thing I would say, and I think Alizan and Darshan mentioned this, the mobilization of climate finance. Both mitigation and adaptation needs to be activated on many fronts, right? So yes, government plays a role, but governments have fiscal constraints. Yes, development finance plays a role. Multilateral development banks, IFIs, and so on, but they have also capacity limits. There's a huge space for domestic finance, which then goes back to the question of mobilizing savings and mobilizing private sector funding within countries for adaptation just as much as for mitigation. And final thing, picking up on Alizan, your point, there is a role for insurance in all of this, right? So the ability for this industry to have deep understanding of the risks that are faced by commercial interests, by the private sector and beyond, and being able to then innovate and create new products, such as paramedic insurance and so on, will play a part in helping to mobilize the funding that is needed. So certainly a big, complex, hairy problem. We're seeing some signals in the positive direction. Needs to go a lot faster. And I think there's much that Malaysian players can also do along these lines. I'll stop there, Dato. Thanks for the final comment.
Thanks, Dave. That's useful.